Okay, welcome back to the newest video. In the last video, you learned how to briefly create something in the playground, how to write a very simple piece of code that does something in the app. So today we're going to build on that and talk about something called variables and constants. So again, I'm going to use the playground just because we're playing about with concepts and ideas here. So click here. Again, we use a blank template and give a new file name. Let's do Swift lesson 2. And again, I'll save mine to the desktop. Of course, if you're following in this at home, you could just use the one playground file and then just keep deleting and changing it. But you might also find it better if you then save each playground file for each lesson, and then as it gets more complicated and you want to go back and review things, then you can see what you've done and use it as just a little portfolio of programs or codes that you can refer back to when you need them. So before we begin talking about variables and constants, I just want to highlight one convention in coding. When we start beginning to create names for our pieces of data, in the last video, I used the word message, which was just all one word lowercase. When you begin to make variables which are more than one word, because your program starts to get more complicated, we have the convention where the first letter in the word is lowercase, and then every other word is written in uppercase or starts with uppercase. It's generally considered easier to read. So I'll type out some examples and hopefully you'll be able to see what it means. So the example that we should ideally be trying to follow is the one in the middle here. So the first word starts lowercase, and then the second word has the capital T, and then obviously the capital E, the capital T, the capital R. Generally, when you watch the other YouTube videos or you start coding in groups or teams, the general convention is that we use it this way. So let me just get rid of those. So when you begin to write your code and design your projects, you'll need to begin to identify all the pieces of information that the software will need and the app will need to run and work properly. If that piece of information will never change, it's what's known as a constant. If that piece of information could or will change, we call it a variable. So some practical examples of variables may be a person's age, or if a company holds information about a person each year, that number will obviously go up by 1 as they get a year older. Another example would be a person's weight. Depending on what the person does or eats, that weight could potentially go up or down. So when we identify a piece of information or data that we want our app to use, when we first create it in Xcode, we need to tell Xcode whether it's a constant or a variable. If it's a variable, we type var, V-A-R, as you can see with the template that you already have. So if, for example, we wanted to create a piece of data about the person's age, we would type it like this. Here, age is the name of the piece of data that we are creating, and we are giving it the value of 23. Every time we create a piece of data or information, we need to give it a unique name so that Xcode can identify it and use it. So if we were to use another example, let's just say weight, as we talked about earlier, we could then again make it a variable. So VAR. You can also, as you type it, you can see that we start, as I mentioned before, it starts to give you ideas and things, but here we have the var, but then at the bottom it also gives you a little bit of information about what it is or perhaps what it does. So here var creates a variable that can be changed. If you click the return key, it sometimes fills in like these little templates that you can then fill in. So if whatever's blue, you would then just type the weight, and then if you were to press like the tab key, then it will just switch on to the next one. If you find it confusing, you can obviously just press delete and then just type it as you so wish. I'm English, so we tend to use kilograms or sometimes stones. So if you're an American and you're more used to pounds, I guess conceptually just pretend that this is a child. Okay, so now I'll give you one to think about or do. Let's just say that you're doing an app for a shop and you have 20 units of something. How might you code that? Please pause the video for a second and perhaps have a little think and maybe try and typing it out onto Xcode if you're doing Xcode as you follow the video. Okay, so let's go through the logic together to decide how we're going to deal with this problem. So firstly, it's an item of stock, which means the numbers can change. People will either buy the product, making the number go down, or the store will replenish its stock level, and so that number will go up. So here we need to tell Xcode that it's going to be a variable. So to do that, we again type in var. We need to then give it a name that makes sense to you. I'm just going to type item quantity for the time being. And again, using the convention of the lowercase I and the capital Q. And then it's just a case of putting equals and then 20. So now that we've created these three basic pieces of data, we can now begin to do things with them. In the last video, we basically printed out a message in the console for the user. Do you remember how to do that? Go ahead and give it a try yourself first. If you managed to do this, congratulations. For those that didn't remember, we'll do it together. So it's print and then brackets. And then let's just say we'll print the item quantity this time. And so when we press play or compile is the proper phrase for it, it will generate a message here of just 20. As we said that these are variables and they can change, let's show you how you would change the piece of information or a piece of data. You only need to tell Xcode whether it's a variable or a constant once. So to change it, it's just a case of typing out the name of that piece of data that you want to change and then giving it a new value by doing equals and then here. And just so that you can see that it's been changed, we could then again print the same piece of data again. So if we stop the last program and then run it again, you'll see both a 20 and a 15. The reason why you see both the 20 and the 15 is because when it compiles, it starts on the first line and then works its way down. So here we've obviously told it to print the item quantity value, and at that time it was 20, and then it's completed that, and then it moves down further down the line to code and it comes across another message telling it to print, but this time the quantity has been changed to 15. So it literally does exactly what it tells you to do. It doesn't just print out the most recent one. It will print every time it tells you to print. So we've shown you how to use the variables and how to create those. Let's now talk about the constants. If a piece of data is a constant, it means it's never going to change. We tell Xcode that it's a constant by using the word let when creating the name of the data type or the name of the piece of data. So an example might be an ID number. Most people in most countries have some kind of ID number, or it may well be that you are a member of something in a company or a shopping group or a club or something, and then you'll have some kind of ID number that that the company uses to identify you and obviously send you information and special offers and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to use the example of perhaps having a tax ID number, because pretty much everyone in the country, in the world, has to pay some form of tax. So to do that, we would just simply type let and then give ourselves the name of that piece of data. Let's just say tax ID number. And then let's just give them a simple number. As I said, this is a constant and we can't change it. So if we were to try and change it for whatever reason, say tax ID number equals, and maybe 45321, you'll then find that a error message will pop up. If you click on this part of the error message, it then expands so you can see the full message, and it will tell you a bit clearer what the issue is. So here it says, cannot I assign to value tax ID number is a let constant. Sometimes it will give you a solution to the problem. Here it's asking you to change let to a var, i.e. make the piece of data, instead of being a constant, make it a variable. And if you press fix, then you'll see that it changes it. It's worth being careful with following the advice of Xcode. Obviously, Xcode is scanning your code, but at the best, it's only guessing what you're going to want to do or what you want to make. So here, following Xcode's advice actually changes it so in a way that we don't really want it to. We want it to still be a constant, but now it's a variable. So let's just change this back to let. And let's just delete that altogether. So my advice will be just think twice before clicking on the fix button every time, because it may actually send you in a completely different direction, and then your app may not be working the way that you expect it to work. It's also worth talking a little bit about the error code that you'll see. When we change the tax ID number, let me just bring it up one more time. There are generally two types of color codes that they use when they give you messages. Red basically means that there's something fundamentally wrong with the code and that you won't be able to run the app at all, even if you wanted to. It just doesn't work. There are also sometimes when you're typing, you'll see an alert come up and it's kept the background of yellow. The yellow ones, you can ignore them and your code will still run. But generally, it's Xcode's attempt to tell you that you've either created a piece of data that you're not using, and it suggests a way of changing it to make it easier for Xcode to compile. Or generally, Xcode's attempt to just tell you the way that you could change your code to make it easier for Xcode to compile and perhaps make it run a little bit quicker and more efficiently. Another thing that I'd like to show you is the use of comments. If you're working by yourself, it's still useful to make comments sometimes. You may start working on a project or a piece of code and then leave it for a couple of weeks, and then when you're looking at lines of text, it takes a while for you to remember what you did or what you're thinking when you did so. So to write a comment and have Xcode ignore it and not try and compile it into a program, you simply just press like the two forward slashes, I think they're called, and then anything you type afterwards, then Xcode will ignore it. This is a comment. And so literally, if you were to run the program or compile the program, Xcode completely ignores it. If you were to type a comment without this, then you'll probably see that it will very quickly give you some kind of error message saying it doesn't really recognize what you're doing. So let's put it back in. So an example here might be, you may want to add a comment to say, like, we are using kilograms, so that if two people in a team are looking at that, then they can obviously tell which type of weight unit they're using. Equally, age could potentially be like months or years or however, or days, perhaps if it was a baby. So you can obviously use the comments just throughout the code to help explain the logic of what you're doing and why you're doing it. If you're doing a very complicated project and you need your comments to last over several lines of code, then you can type like the / and the star. If you press return, it should automatically put in the bottom bit. If not, you'll need to type it, and then you'll be able to add several lines of code. And again, you can see that running it or compiling the program, Xcode completely ignores what's written in here. So besides telling Xcode whether it's a variable or a constant, we also need to tell Xcode what type of data it is. Because once you've created that piece of data, for example, age, then if you assign it to one set type of data, you then can't change it to a different type. So if, for example, we wanted to change the age, let's just say age is now, I don't know, 23.5 years old, you'll then find that Xcode will give you an error message. And again, if you click on it, it will say, cannot assign value of type double to type int. And we ignore it for just a second. And that's because Xcode has, when you've created the age piece of information, you've typed 23, and in Xcode, whole numbers and numbers that are decimals are classed as two different types of data. So 23 is what we call an integer or a whole number. And so because you've created it, first of all, as an integer value, it's then taken or automatically assumed that that piece of information is an integer. So if you then try and change it into something that isn't an integer, then Xcode will tell you that you can't do it. Of course, we can change or actually tell Xcode at the very start what type of data type it is, so Xcode doesn't have to guess. For this example, for most people or most apps, you don't really care about how old you are in whole years unless you're a child, and then being 6.5 is a big step. So let's just stick with being an integer. So if we tell Xcode it's an integer, then we just need to type in the colon and then int. And then you can see below here it says assigned integer type of value. So now we are saying that the piece of information or piece of data is a variable. That piece of information has the name age. The type of data that age is an integer, and the value of that integer is 23. So let's then look at the weight example. If we were to change weight, maybe the person is a weight loss app or something, a fitness app, and you've actually managed to lose some weight. So you then drop down to 74.5. This time it will tell you that you can't assign a value type double to a type int. A double is a phrase that they used for numbers which have decimal points. So for example, 74.5 is a double. You could remove the error message or the problem by, when you first creating it, just making it a double number at the start. So then when you create it, the very first instance of the value is a double. So then Xcode will say, okay, this is always going to be a double. So then when you change it to 74.5, it doesn't complain. That's fine, that's one way of doing it. But another way is, again, just to explicitly say that it's a double. So again, we just type on the colon, and this time you just need to write double up here. The benefit of doing it this way is that when you first create a piece of data, it will accept the 75, the integer value, but it will still know inside its background programming that it's a double value, so it would be 75.0. So then when you change the weight to 74.5, it doesn't complain and it continues to work. For this piece of information that we've created, quantities and items and things are probably integers. You don't often buy half of something. So again, we could create this one to be an integer. In the example at the very top, the hello playground, obviously we have the variable, and that variable is called str, and then that str name piece of data has something that we call a string. A string is basically a chain of text or numbers or symbols, basically just characters that are all kind of joined together. And Xcode knows the start and the end of the string by the speech marks. So you have a speech mark to start string and a speech mark to end, or tell Xcode where the string ends. So again, if you type this one, the hello playground, Xcode will automatically know it's a string. But if you wanted to make it even clearer for Xcode, then you would just again do the colon and then the string. So then if we were to look at the last data type that we created, the tax ID number, at the moment, Xcode is thinking that it's an integer value, as in it's a type of number. You may or you may not be happy with it being this way. If it's a number, then of course you can add to it, you can subtract, you can divide, you can do mathematical things to it, which you probably don't want to do. You're probably more interested in the number just as itself, like almost like a name. So you may want to make the number a string. Because when you're probably using something like a tax number, you probably just want to know, is this the right tax number or is it not the right tax number? If you do want to make it a string, then you could just type in the colon string and then of course add the speech marks. The last type of data type that we're going to talk about in this video is something called a Boolean. A Boolean is basically a piece of data that will tell you whether something is true or false. So actually let's make it a variable, something that could be true or false. So if we were to maybe have an app that was a social media or some sort of membership account, you may want to know if someone is alive or not. And so we could just say variable is alive, and then the Boolean will either be, it will be true or it will be false. Another example, if you want a slightly more happy example, is sunny day, and then equals true or obviously false. So what we're saying is that we've created a variable piece of data, and we've named that piece of data is sunny day, and the value that we've given is sunny day is true, and that type of data type is a Boolean, and we just type BOOL, like bool. And again, it will tell you down here a value type whose instances are either true or false. Okay, so we're going to stop there, but before we do, we'll very quickly review some of the things that we've covered in this video. So the first bit is obviously using these lines to make comments. So we have var, var, which is data that can change. We've also talked about the let, and that is data that can never change. So when we create a piece of data, we always need to, lowercase let. Whenever we create a piece of data, we need to tell Xcode whether it's going to be a variable or whether it's going to be a constant. Then also we then need to tell Xcode what type of data that's going to be. So it could potentially be a string. And if you remember, a string is, I guess, a chain of characters. And if we want to tell Xcode it's a string, we use big S string. Let's just put an example, I guess, here. We then have the types of number. So the first one was an integer, which is a whole number. For example, just the number 5. And we identify integers by just typing int. The next example would be a double, and a double is a number that has a decimal, or I guess you could think of it as a number that has a fraction. An example might be 5.5, or, and we use the phrase, the word double, when we're coding. And the last one that we talked about today was a Boolean, which is a true or false value, e.g. true. So it may not seem like it, but you've been already making pretty big strides in understanding some of the fundamentals of coding that you're going to be using in every single app and every single project that you work on. So please do review the video, go through it yourself, maybe create some variables yourself and play around and perhaps try changing them, printing them up onto the console, and I'll work on the next video and I'll hopefully see you in the next video.